Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is your tropical update for October 8th. Tropical storm Julia is making its way towards hurricane status as we speak. It's expected to continue to strengthen as it makes its way towards Nicaragua. Here on the latest recon, we see the center approaching the two islands of San Andres and Providencia off the coast of Nicaragua and a decent bit off of that coast. As we can see here today, the satellite image, nothing going on in the Atlantic except for Julia. Julia, the only feature taking up much of the Caribbean Sea today, and that's how it looks. The impact map remains at a moderate due to storm surge and rainfall, especially for Nicaragua, San Andres, and Providencia, as well as stronger tropical storm force winds and lots of heavy rain over the remainder of Nicaragua. Portions of Costa Rica, Honduras, El Salvador could experience tropical storm force winds as well as significant rainfall, which could extend all the way up to the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico. Here is the zoomed in satellite image of Julia today. As we can see here, here is San Andres and Providencia here. Here is the coastline of Nicaragua here. So rain already beginning in those areas. Winds now at 65 miles an hour with the storm pressure down to 993 millibars. That's incorrect here on the graphic. And also worth noting, the National Hurricane Center saying a 20% chance that the storm reforms in the eastern Pacific. It is worth noting that now the NHC code explicitly calls for this storm to transfer from the Atlantic into the Pacific Ocean, as we can see by the tropical storm warnings on the Pacific coast of Nicaragua and Honduras, and the tropical storm watch on the Pacific coast, obviously, of El Salvador. And so significant rainfall is the main concern, 6 to 12 on those two islands, 5 to 10, isolated to 15 in Nicaragua, isolated to a foot over the rest of South Central America. And as we head towards the Mexican Isthmus, we can see 2 to 4 inches isolated to 6. Storm surge also a concern. And that should say in the island, yeah, so I guess that's true. San Andres and Providencia, 2 to 4 feet of storm surge. Nicaragua going to see 4 to 6 feet of storm surge. Widespread tropical storm force winds, hurricane force winds possible as well. Again, the main concern with this one is going to be rain. Could also be a decent bit of a wind maker, but not necessarily the biggest one we've ever seen. We'll talk more about that track and crossing over to the Pacific here shortly. As we can see here, tropical storm force winds all but likely for the majority of Nicaragua. As we can see from the forecast here, we are expecting this storm to reach Category 1 strength before landfall, which will occur in about 18 hours from now. It's moving up a little bit in terms of time. The storm also a bit south of where we thought it to be originally, which is helping the odds of this storm crossing into the Pacific, which makes sense, obviously. Central America is much thicker to the north than it is down here south. Southern Nicaragua and Costa Rica is much more thin than Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador trying to go across all that landmass. So where exactly and how far it gets across that is kind of up for debate. If it continues here in the Pacific, the Hurricane Center taking it basically along the coastline here before dissipating. Some models take it straight in and it doesn't have a problem. I mean, it gets choked up a little bit, loses a little bit of strength, but it bounces right back up. Or, it kind of rides this coastline and then turns up and crosses back into the Atlantic. That's an option too. That'd be the first time that has ever happened. And here's the European projection of that. Are 3 options here. The one's becoming much less likely, this northern track over all of Central America and Mexico down into the southern Gulf of Mexico. The most likely track that it makes it into the Pacific somewhat might reform, might be the same thing, might die and then reform, who knows. And then it might cross up here. That's the third option, is it crosses back up into the southern Gulf of Mexico. And as you can see, if it moves into the Gulf of Mexico, conditions are favorable to bring this thing towards Florida, which would be less than ideal considering the impacts Florida just sustained due to a hurricane, in case you missed the previous storm. And so the main thing worth noting here is it might leave the Atlantic. Well, it will leave the Atlantic. The question is, does it form in the Pacific? And then after that, does it form in the Atlantic again? Honestly, who knows? The GFS showing much of the same scenario, though not giving us the option for the split. But as you can tell by these basically paintball splattering of low pressures from the Caribbean Sea to the Gulf to the entire Pacific Ocean, this thing, we don't know what's going to happen in the long term with this thing. What we do know is short term, lots of rain expected over Central America. How many storms we get out of this, how exactly they all turn out, we're just going to have to wait till it happens. And in the meantime, southern Mexico, Central America, you got a storm on your horizon. This was not updated either, at least the stats on this, but the information on here is correct. 20 times we have had storms cross from the Atlantic to Pacific or from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Only twice has that happened, twice in 1 year. 1988 and 1996 are the two duplicate years. There was also one that reformed after dissipating in 1998. We already have it happen once this year, so it'd be the third year we've had two storms cross over with Bonnie earlier this year. There are also, like I mentioned, sometimes it forms, dissipates, and then forms into another storm. That's happened 26 times for a total of 46 crossover storms in some respect for another. And that's happened several years as well, 5 duplicate years there. Bringing the total duplicate years to 7 on record this year would likely be the 8th year, regardless of whether it dissipates or not. It's probably getting added to that list. So that's all I have for today. Again, we don't know the long term with this storm, but what we do know is lots of rain is expected in Nicaragua. That's all for now. Chris Dixon of Weather Catholic Media.